My name is Harold Carter, and I am 74 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 22nd, 1997. It was my third year working as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park, and it changed my life forever. I love everything about being a park ranger. The towering trees that have stood sentinel for centuries, the diverse wildlife that roams freely through the vast wilderness, and those geysers that never fail to impress. It's my kind of paradise. Yellowstone has a raw, untamed beauty that never ceases to take my breath away. I spend a lot of time alone out here. Don't get me wrong, I see tourists all the time. It's talking with my fellow rangers that's scarce. But I don't mind. Solitude suits me, allowing me to immerse myself in the natural world around me. The whisper of wind through the pines, the distant call of an elk, the bubbling of hot springs, these are the sounds that fill my days. Sometimes, though, I wish I had company out in the thick of the trails. The vastness of Yellowstone can be overwhelming, and there are moments when the isolation weighs heavily on me. Little did I know that on that fateful day in July, I would come to cherish those moments of solitude. The day this all started, I set out early. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of the night, but I knew it would warm up quickly. There had been reports of downed trees blocking one of the more popular hiking trails, and it was my job to clear the way. It was routine work, the kind that fills most of my days. I grabbed my gear, axe, saw, water bottles, and a packed lunch, and headed into the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds greeting the morning sun, and shafts of golden light pierced through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. I found the first fallen tree a little past noon. A big old pine had come right down across the path, its massive trunk creating an impassable barrier for hikers. I set my pack down and got to work, the rhythmic sound of my saw cutting through the quiet of the forest. It was hot and sweaty work despite the shade, so I took frequent water breaks. The physical labor was demanding, but there was something satisfying about it. With each cut, I was helping to maintain the trails that allowed others to experience the beauty of Yellowstone. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the forest. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, providing momentary relief from the heat. I paused for a moment, wiping sweat from my brow, and took in the scenery around me. The towering trees, the patches of wildflowers, the distant call of a woodpecker. It was moments like these that reminded me why I loved my job so much. Little did I know that this sense of peace was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. The scream cut through the air like a knife, instantly chilling my blood. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched and choked with terror. The sound seemed to come from deeper in the trees, not too far from where I was working. I dropped my saw, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. Adrenaline surged through my body, making my vision tunnel. "Hello?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer, just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, another scream pierced the air, louder this time and unmistakably closer. I took off running, pushing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face as I ran. "I'm coming," I shouted, hoping my voice would provide some comfort to whoever was in distress. "Hold on!" I burst through a thick patch of bushes, and suddenly there she was. A young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with blonde hair matted with leaves and dirt. She was collapsed against a large boulder, her body shaking with sobs. As I approached, I saw that her hands were covered in blood. "Hey," I said, dropping to my knees beside her. "Are you all right? What happened?" She didn't speak, just pointed shakily further down the path. Her hands were trembling, covered in red, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't her own blood. Following the direction of her frantic gestures, my stomach dropped. There, lying face down in the dirt about 20 feet away, was a body. "Stay here," I told the woman, my voice sounding surprisingly calm despite the panic rising in my chest. I approached the body cautiously, my eyes darting around the surrounding forest. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. The man, I could see now it was a man, was wearing a backpack with a bright green sleeping bag strapped to it. Probably a hiker, like so many others who came to explore Yellowstone's beauty. Now he lay motionless in the dirt, his body unnaturally still. "Sir," I called out, clinging to a desperate hope. "Are you all right?" Silence was my only answer. I knelt beside him, my hand shaking as I reached out to check for a pulse. I gently rolled him over, and that's when I wished I hadn't. The man's chest was, there's no word for it. Torn open is the closest I can get, but it doesn't begin to describe the horror of what I saw. It was as if something huge had clawed at him, ripping out his insides with savage fury. There was blood everywhere, and bits of him I couldn't even identify. The forest floor was a canvas of gore, painted in shades of red I never knew existed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear attack? There had been a few sightings recently, but even as the thought formed, I knew this was something different, something worse. Rising to my feet, my brain worked at full speed. The woman was clearly in shock. I had to get her out of here, and I needed to call for help. But how? My radio was back with my gear near the felled trees. Do I leave the woman to get it? What if whatever did this comes back? I was frozen with indecision when I heard it. A crunching sound of twigs and leaves from the woods behind us. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, expecting to see a bear. But what I saw instead would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. The creature that emerged from the shadows of the forest was tall, too tall to be human, and it moved all wrong. It stood on two legs, yes, but it was hunched over, its posture a mockery of human stance. Its arms were impossibly long, dragging on the ground like some primordial ape. But it wasn't an ape. It wasn't anything that belonged in this world. The thing was covered in what at first glance looked like dark fur. But as it moved closer, I realized with growing horror that it was matted hair, long tangled, and matted with what looked horribly like dried blood. The creature tilted its head as if curious, and I found myself staring into its face. Its eyes were small and deep-set in a face that was both human and not. The jaw was too wide, stretching across its face in a grotesque parody of a smile, filled with long yellowing teeth. It snarled silently, and that's when I saw the blood on its hands. Not hands, claws. Long, curved, and wickedly sharp, still dripping with fresh blood. The woman behind me let out another scream, this one filled with pure, unadulterated terror. It broke the spell of horror that had frozen me in place. "Run!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. "Run now!" The creature lunged forward with frightening speed, but I was already moving. I bolted back the way I came, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. It was a desperate sprint, fueled by pure survival instinct. I could hear the woman's cries behind me, interspersed with those horrible snarls that seemed to grow closer with each passing second. My breath burned in my lungs, and my legs threatened to give out, but I pushed on. Adrenaline gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I barely felt them. My entire world had narrowed down to this: run or die. I burst into the clearing where I had left my tools, and I saw them, my radio and my axe. In that split second, I had to make a choice. I snatched up the axe just as the creature burst from the tree line. For a wild moment, I considered facing it, protecting the woman I'd now dragged into this nightmare. But it was a ridiculous notion. This thing wasn't an animal. It was something twisted, something wrong, and I wasn't a hero. "Run towards the park entrance," I yelled at the woman, hoping she could hear me over the pounding of my own heart. Grabbing my radio, I followed my own advice and ran. My legs pumped furiously, my breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I fumbled with the radio as I ran, calling desperately for backup. My voice was panicked, barely coherent as I gave the ranger station the bare essentials of our location. Then the voice of Janice, the dispatcher, came through, telling me help was on the way, to hang tight. But hanging tight was the one thing I couldn't do. I could hear the snarls behind me, closer with each passing second. Janice's voice crackled over the radio again, telling me helicopters and a team of rangers were inbound. They were minutes away, but minutes might as well have been years. The creature would be on me long before then. I pushed myself harder, my lungs threatening to burst, my limbs on fire. Then I heard it, the woman's scream behind me, piercing and desperate. Then it cut off abruptly. A terrible silence fell over the forest. Dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Tears of frustration stung my eyes as I ran faster, branches whipping my face. I had to make it. I couldn't let that thing catch me. The trees began to thin out ahead. I could see a break in the foliage, an opening, and that's when I spotted it, the old Firewatch Tower. The Firewatch Tower loomed ahead, a rusted relic from a bygone era. It wasn't much, but it was my only hope. I scrambled towards it, my legs burning with the effort. I reached the base of the tower and grabbed the rusted ladder, cursing my trembling hands as I began to climb. The metal rungs were slick with moisture, making each step a potential disaster. But fear gave me strength, and I hauled myself up with desperate energy. The platform was only 20 feet up. Not much of a defense, but it was better than being on the ground. Gasping for air, I collapsed onto the wooden planks, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. After a moment, I risked a look back. The creature was there at the base of the tower, staring up at me with those terrible eyes. It snarled and pawed at the metal rungs, but it couldn't seem to figure out how to climb. The throbbing in my legs began to lessen. The pounding in my head started to subside. I clung to the railing for dear life, my knuckles white with the effort. That's when I heard it, the most glorious sound I've ever known. Helicopters. The sound of rotor blades filled the air, growing louder by the second. 3 helicopters appeared over the tree line, their powerful spotlights piercing the dimming forest. My adrenaline spiked again, not in fear this time, but in the hope of rescue. I waved my arms frantically, trying to catch their attention. One of the helicopters descended, stirring up leaves and dust with its powerful blades. Below, I saw rangers spill out of the chopper. Men and women I knew, some of them trained with firearms. They moved in a tactical formation, rifles raised, shouting for me to stay put. But my eyes were drawn to the trees. The creature had vanished back into the shadows as if it had never been there. It felt like a lifetime before they managed to get me down from the tower. They lowered a harness, and I fumbled with the straps, my hands still shaking from the ordeal. When my feet finally touched solid ground, my legs turned to jelly, and I nearly collapsed. 2 rangers flanked me, their guns pointed outwards as we made our way back into the woods. We found the man's body first, the gruesome scene just as I had left it. Then we found the woman, or what was left of her. The aftermath was horrific, far worse than the initial sight of the man's corpse. I can't put the details into words. The rangers were hard men, weathered by the things they'd seen out here, but they blanched at the sight. One of them turned aside to vomit. There was no sign of the creature. It had vanished like a ghost, though the evidence of its inhuman brutality was sickeningly real. The rangers collected what was left of the woman's body, solemnly bagging the pieces. The man, at least, was easier to recover. I was spared none of this, the ordeal not ending even with my rescue. That night I found myself back at the ranger station, giving my statement. It was a blur of well-meaning faces, offers of coffee and blankets, concerned questions. I answered mechanically, still trapped inside my own head, replaying the day's events, the screams, the chase, and the sight of those things the monster had left behind. Janice, the dispatcher whose voice had been a lifeline during my escape, pulled me aside. Her face was etched with concern, her eyes searching mine as if looking for something she hoped not to find. "I know you're in shock, Harold," she said gently, "but we need to talk about what you saw back there. That thing." The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. I described it as best I could. The hunched posture, the matted hair, the too wide jaw, and those damn eyes. Deep set and gleaming in the dark like an animal, yet with a chilling intelligence behind them. Janice listened, her face growing paler with each detail. They searched the woods the next day, and the day after that. No sign of the creature, not a footprint, not a strand of hair. The park was shut down, tourists turned away. A whole section of Yellowstone was cordoned off. They even brought in search dogs, but the creature was gone, swallowed up by the wilderness as if it had never been there. The aftermath. Well, let's just say it's been hell. Reporters swarmed like vultures, local ones at first, then national as the story made headlines. Beast of Yellowstone, they called it, stirring up a frenzy. Conspiracy theorists popped up, raving about aliens or government experiments gone wrong. Some even accused me, saying I'd made it all up, or worse, that I was the monster. I was put on leave, of course. Mandatory counseling sessions, psych evaluations, the whole 9 yards. They asked the same questions over and over. Could it have been a bear? Did I see it clearly? Was it possible I'd imagined the whole thing? Maybe it was the shock, the trauma playing tricks on my mind. They kept searching the woods, finding nothing, and I could see the doubt lingering in their eyes. The worst part was, I began to doubt myself too. There were no witnesses, no evidence of the thing except for what it did to those poor people. The nights became a waking nightmare. I'd see the creature's face every time I closed my eyes, those gleaming eyes and yellow teeth, the blood on its claws. I'd see the woman, what was left of her, and hear her screams echoing in my head. Months passed, and the furor died down a little. There were no new attacks, no sightings of the creature. Life in the little tourist town near the park started to return to normal. But it wasn't normal for me. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, that the thing was still out there, waiting. I started checking over my shoulder every 2 minutes, jumping at any odd sound. The trees that once felt like home now seemed menacing, every shadow a potential hiding place for the monster. My fellow rangers tried to be supportive, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They'd smile and nod when I talked about the creature, but their expressions were those of people humoring someone they thought might be losing their grip on reality. It was isolating, to say the least. A year after the incident, I quit the Park Service. I couldn't bear the sight of the forest anymore. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. The wilderness I once loved had become a source of constant terror. I moved away, trying to rebuild a life somewhere the woods weren't looming over me. I found a small apartment in a bustling city, surrounded by concrete and steel instead of trees and mountains. Some days I almost succeeded in convincing myself that what happened in Yellowstone was just a terrible nightmare. I told myself it was a rogue bear attack, a freak accident amplified by trauma and fear. I forced myself to forget the creature's too human face, the calculating malevolence in its eyes. But then there were the reports. It started with whispers, rumors on the internet that I tried my best to ignore. But soon the stories were impossible to overlook. Not in Yellowstone, no. The attacks were happening hundreds of miles away, deep in other national forests. Missing hikers, bodies torn apart, all bearing the same gruesome signature I had witnessed that day in Yellowstone. People whispered the same name, the beast. They didn't know the details. How could they? But I knew. It was out there, still hunting. The news stories fueled my nightmares. I started carrying a gun, learned how to use it properly. Some nights I'd leave my blinds open, watching the shadows shift in the streetlights below, just in case. The city that had once felt like a safe haven now seemed like a fragile illusion of security. I tried reaching out to my old colleagues at Yellowstone, but the response was always the same. Polite dismissals, gentle suggestions that maybe I should talk to someone about what I'd been through. They didn't want to hear about the new attacks, didn't want to consider that what had happened that day might be part of something larger and more terrifying. The other rangers, well, we didn't talk about it, not directly, but sometimes at reunions, I'd catch them watching me, their eyes filled with pity or something worse, like they thought I'd broken, that I was one step away from snapping, hunting a monster that may only exist inside my head. And maybe they were right. Maybe the trauma had warped my mind, made me see connections where there were none, but deep down, I knew the truth. The beast was real, and it was still out there. It's been nearly 3 decades since that day in Yellowstone, and I'm an old man now. The world has moved on, forgotten about the Beast of Yellowstone incident. It's become nothing more than a local legend, a story to scare tourists around campfires. But I haven't forgotten. I can't forget. I've spent years researching, gathering every scrap of information I could find about similar attacks. I've plotted them on maps, looking for patterns, trying to understand the creature's movements. And slowly a picture has emerged. It's not just one beast. There are more of them out there, hidden in the wild places of the world. They're smart, they're careful, and they're patient. They strike rarely, but when they do, it's with terrifying brutality. I've tried to warn people, to get the authorities to take it seriously. But who's going to listen to an old man rambling about monsters in the woods? I'm just another crackpot, another conspiracy theorist to be ignored or pitied. But I know the truth, and that's why I'm writing this now, putting my story down in the hope that someday, someone will believe. Someone will understand the danger that's out there, lurking in the shadows of our wilderness. To whoever reads this, be careful out there. The woods are beautiful, but they hide secrets. Dark, terrible secrets. And sometimes, those secrets have teeth and claws. My name is Harold Carter. I'm 74 years old, and this is my warning to the world. Even when I was little, I had a great love for Michigan. Ever since my parents decided on an impromptu spring vacation up in the vacation home that belonged to my grandparents, I was smitten. The secluded cabin, the fields splayed out right beside it that I could play all day in. What wasn't there to love? That cabin was my safe place. There was nothing up there I didn't find absolutely breathtaking and wonderful. That was until a few years ago. In 2019, my husband and I had finally tied the knot after being together for 6 years, and that's when my parents gave us the news that they would be selling us the cabin. In only a matter of 4 days, after deciding to spend our honeymoon up in Michigan, before packing up our lives back home, Ryan, my husband, and I were catching a flight to our new home. The familiarity of the gravel road crunching beneath the rental car's tires was what woke me from my unintentional sleep, as well as Ryan's low whistle and amazement at the acres of land. "Wow, hun, you weren't kidding. This place is something else." I laughed. "When will you learn I'm always right?" In the midst of our banter, Ryan had parked the car in the middle of the large driveway, and the second the car doors automatically unlocked, I was outside, breathing in the fresh air. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits, though now it seemed smaller somehow. The dark wood siding had weathered to a deep gray, and the wraparound porch creaked ominously under my feet as I approached. Something felt different this time, though I couldn't place what it was. The silence was too complete, too heavy. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place. We pulled our luggage from the trunk, and I practically sprinted up the front stairs with my suitcase thumping up them behind me. "Hurry up, slowpoke, our honeymoon awaits." Ryan only shook his head and laughed. "Carmen, I love you, but we both know you couldn't give a crap about our honeymoon right now. You just want to get inside and bask in the memories of your youth." I rolled my eyes, taking the keys from my husband's hand once he reached me. "Are you calling me old?" I turned the key in the lock, twisting the door handle. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Dust particles floated in the air inside the cabin, cloth tarps covering the furniture. No one had been up here since my grandparents passed away in 2013. Even when my parents found out they inherited the place, they never visited. The interior smelled of mildew and something else I couldn't identify, something sour and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. The floorboards creaked with every step, and I noticed several of them were loose, creating gaps where shadows seemed to pool. The windows were grimy, filtering the afternoon light into an eerie amber glow that made everything look diseased. "Needs more than a good dusting," I muttered, but forced a smile for Ryan's benefit. "I think we can handle that." Ryan held on to me tightly, looking around the house with growing concern. "It's rustic," he said diplomatically, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. That first night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin like someone was looking for a way in. Ryan was fast asleep beside me, exhausted from our travel and the day of cleaning. I lay frozen, listening to the measured pace of boots on wooden planks. The steps would pause at each window, and I imagined someone peering through the glass, studying us as we slept. The month of our honeymoon was perfect for the most part. Some light cleaning and relaxing. It was halfway through our stay there that Ryan and I found out we were expecting. It hadn't been planned, but we were absolutely ecstatic nonetheless. In fact, my pregnancy was one of the reasons my husband left the night of my first real encounter with this person. My cravings had come in full force, and Ryan, being the great husband he is, drove the hour-long journey into town to get me my potato chips and mint chocolate chip ice cream. The nearest store was in Brookfield, a small town that seemed to exist solely to serve the scattered cabins and hunting lodges in the area. The locals there were friendly enough, but they all seemed to know something about our property that they weren't sharing. Alone in the cabin, I was lying under my blanket on the couch, dozing off to the sounds of the TV, when the knocking began. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, but then it came again, 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't the TV. Someone was actually pounding on the front door. I've always been scared of being by myself when it was dark. All I know is that when night fell, my skin would crawl and I would jump at the smallest of sudden noises. My body was frozen in its spot. My heart began to thump rapidly against my chest. The knocking continued, growing more insistent, more demanding. Then came the voice. Carmen, let me in. It's Ryan." But it wasn't Ryan's voice, not really. It sounded like someone trying to imitate him, getting the tone wrong, the inflection all off. The voice was too rough, too strained, like someone who had been screaming for hours. I couldn't move. I couldn't even twitch. The only thing I could do was lay frozen as tears began to stream down my face. The voice continued calling my name. But with each repetition, it became less and less like my husband's voice. It grew deeper, more guttural, with an edge that made my skin crawl. "I know you're in there, Carmen. I can see you through the window." The voice was taunting now, cruel. "Why won't you let me in? Don't you love me anymore?" When the banging stopped, I thought it was over, but I was entirely wrong. Heavy footsteps began to move around the cabin, and I could hear someone testing the windows, trying to find one that might be unlocked. The person moved methodically, checking each window in turn, and I realized with growing horror that they knew the layout of the cabin perfectly. My eyes widened as I realized my horrible mistake. The curtains right beside the TV were pulled open. I'd forgotten to pull them down. As the footsteps grew closer to the living room, I knew that whoever this was would soon be able to see me through the window, and I would be able to see them. What I did next made me feel like I was 5 years old again, but I pulled my blanket over my head and curled in on myself. I couldn't help it. I was terrified. The footsteps stopped directly outside the living room window, and I heard the scraping of fingernails against glass. Right after I pulled my blanket over my eyes, a sharp tapping sound came from the window. Then I heard breathing, heavy and labored, pressed against the glass. The person was so close I could hear their breath fogging the window. "I can see you hiding," the voice whispered, and now it didn't sound like Ryan at all. It was the voice of a stranger, someone who had been watching us, learning our routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "You can't hide from me forever, Carmen. I know all about you. I know about the baby." How could this person know about the pregnancy? We had only found out ourselves a few days ago. The thought that someone had been watching us so closely made my stomach turn. Had they been spying on us through the windows, following us to town? The violation felt absolute. The thing outside let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. It was the sound of someone who had lost their grip on sanity long ago. As I lay there on the brink of sobbing out of fear, I heard keys jingling in the front door. My heart skipped a beat. Ryan was home, but that person was still standing outside the window. I heard rapid footsteps moving away from the window, but I didn't dare look. The front door opened, and Ryan's confused voice called out, "Carmen, why are all the lights off? Are you okay?" I pulled the blanket from my face, my eyes adjusting to the light as Ryan switched on the lamps. His concerned expression quickly turned to alarm when he saw my tear-stained face and how violently I was shaking. Hey, what happened?" His voice was gentle, warm, nothing like the cruel imitation I'd heard outside. I tried to speak, but the only thing that came out was a sob. I wrapped my arms around my husband, unable to stop looking at that window. "Close it," I whispered. "What?" Ryan sounded puzzled. "Close it, Ryan. Please close it." I jumped from the couch and yanked the drapes closed with such force I nearly tore them from the rod. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Carmen, honey, what's wrong? I can't help you if you don't tell me what happened." Ryan grabbed me by my shoulders, turning me away from the window. "There was someone out there, Ryan. They were pretending to be you, trying to get me to open the door. They knew about the baby." The tears came back full force. Ryan's face went pale. "Someone was here? On our property?" I nodded, and I could see the anger building in his eyes. Not at me, but at whoever had terrorized his pregnant wife. "Did you see who it was?" I shook my head. I was too scared to look, but Ryan, they knew things about us. Personal things. They've been watching us. The police arrived nearly 2 hours later. Officer Bradley was a local man who seemed to know the area well. He took down our statement and searched the perimeter of the cabin with his flashlight. When he came back, his expression was grim. "Found some disturbed earth under the living room window," he said. "Boot prints, size 11 or 12. Someone was definitely there." What he didn't tell us until later was that he'd also found something else. A small notebook hidden in the woodpile filled with detailed observations about our daily routines. Times when we left the cabin, what we ate, when we went to bed. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes neat, sometimes barely legible, as if written by someone in the grip of obsession. Despite the police report and the evidence, Ryan and I decided to stay. We made modifications to the cabin, security cameras, motion sensors, and a new lock system. We even got gun licenses and purchased 2 firearms. The local hardware store owner, Pete, seemed unsurprised by our purchases. "You're not the first folks up that way to have trouble," he said cryptically. Years passed, and the incidents became a regular part of our lives. Strange sounds in the night, dead animals left on our property, and the constant feeling of being watched. Our daughter Grace was born the following spring, and 2 years later, our son Danny joined the family. We tried to give them a normal childhood, but it was impossible to ignore the tension that hung over our home. The dead animals were the worst part. We'd find them arranged in deliberate patterns. Rabbits in perfect circles, birds with their wings spread wide, as if someone was trying to send us a message. The local veterinarian, Dr. Morrison, said the animals had been killed cleanly, professionally, with surgical precision. "This isn't random," she told us. "Someone knows what they're doing." Grace started having nightmares when she was 3, always about the man at the window. We'd tried to dismiss it as a child's imagination, but she was too specific in her descriptions. "He has yellow teeth," she'd say, "and his eyes are too big for his face." Ryan and I would exchange worried glances, knowing that we'd never told her about our encounters. The incident that finally drove us away happened just last month. I was working late at the garage in town. My friend Kevin had called saying he was short-staffed and needed help. Ryan was home with the kids, and everything seemed normal until my phone rang at 8 o'clock. "Carmen? Carmen, where are you?" Ryan's voice was frantic, and I could hear both children crying in the background. "I'm still at work, you know that. What's wrong? Are the kids okay?" The terror in my husband's voice made my heart race. "You can't be at work," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "Carmen, you're outside. You're standing at the window, staring at us. You've been there for 20 minutes. The phone line went quiet except for the sound of Grace sobbing. My daughter's voice came through the phone, high-pitched with terror. "Mommy, why won't you come inside? Why are you just standing there?" I could hear little Danny crying in the background, calling for me. "That's not me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Ryan, that's not me. Call the police and get the kids away from the windows." I was already running to my car, my hands shaking as I tried to get the keys in the ignition. The drive home was the longest hour of my life. When I finally reached our property, I saw Ryan's truck parked at the gate, engine running. The kids were in the back seat and Ryan was standing beside the vehicle with his rifle. His face was white with terror. "I saw you," he said when I approached. "I saw you standing at the window, but your face was all wrong. Your eyes were too wide, and your mouth was open like you were screaming, but no sound was coming out. And then you started smiling. But it wasn't your smile. It was someone else's smile using your face." We left that night and never went back. The police found no evidence of an intruder, but they did find something else, a crude shelter built in the woods behind our cabin, filled with photographs of our family taken through telephoto lenses. Pictures of us sleeping, eating, playing with the children, hundreds of them, going back years. We're currently staying with Kevin and his wife while we look for a new place. The cabin that I once considered paradise has become a nightmare that will forever haunt me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear someone calling my name from outside the window. But now I know better than to look. The police investigation is ongoing, but Officer Bradley told us privately that we're not the first family to abandon property in that area. "There's something about that stretch of woods," he said. "Brings out the worst in people. Makes them do things they'd never normally do. I don't know if we'll ever find out who was tormenting us or why they chose our family. All I know is that the person who spent years watching us, learning our habits, imitating our voices, is still out there. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if they've found a new family to terrorize or if they're still waiting for us to come home." I stared at my computer screen, the cursor blinking in the empty reply field. The email from my friend Samantha had arrived just 20 minutes ago, and I'd already read it 4 times. Each reading made the words feel heavier, more real, more terrifying. It was supposed to be a simple invitation, come to my family's cabin in Colorado for a week of hiking, fishing, and getting away from the city. I'd sent the same email to Samantha for 3 years running, and each time she'd politely declined with increasingly elaborate excuses. Work commitments, family obligations, prior plans that seemed to materialize out of thin air. I'd begun to think she simply didn't want to spend a week with me in the mountains. But this email was different. This email contained a confession that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the text. Samantha wasn't avoiding my cabin because she didn't want to come. She was avoiding it because of something that happened 4 years ago at her own family's mountain retreat. Something that had left her unable to sleep properly, unable to be alone in the woods, unable to even look at photographs of dense forest without her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The story she told was impossible. It had to be. People don't just disappear into some kind of living darkness. Cabins don't transform overnight into hollow shells of themselves. 8 strangers don't find themselves trapped together in a place that defies the basic laws of physics and human understanding. Yet as I read her account, filled with details too specific and too strange to be fabricated, I found myself believing every word. Samantha had always been the most practical person I knew. In college, while the rest of us were experimenting with various theories about life and reality, she was studying accounting and planning her career path with military precision. She didn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends. She certainly didn't make them up, which meant that everything she'd written in this email had actually happened to her. The thought made my stomach turn. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the kitchen, needing distance from the words on the screen, but I could still see them in my mind. The description of the man with the too long face and jerky movements, the bitter tea that she'd been forced to drink, the hours of unconsciousness followed by an awakening into a nightmare that seemed to have no rules and no escape. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, trying to process what I'd just read. Samantha had been through something traumatic, something that had clearly left her with lasting psychological damage. The question was, what had really happened to her in that cabin? Was there some kind of rational explanation for the events she described, or was I dealing with something far more sinister? According to Samantha's account, it had all started innocently enough. She was 24 then, visiting her parents at their mountain cabin during one of their rare family vacations. Her father had finally managed to take time off from his demanding job as a surgeon, and they'd planned a week of relaxation in the Colorado wilderness. Samantha had been looking forward to it despite her chronic insomnia that had been plaguing her since her divorce 6 months earlier. The cabin was located about 15 miles outside of a small mountain town called Pine Ridge, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through dense forest for the final 3 miles. Cell phone coverage was spotty at best, and there were no landlines in most of the vacation cabins scattered throughout the area. It was exactly the kind of place people went to disconnect from the world, to find peace in the silence of nature. But for Samantha, the silence had become oppressive. On the 3rd night of their stay, she'd lain in bed for hours, listening to her parents' gentle snoring from the next room and feeling the walls of the cabin closing in around her. The insomnia that had become her constant companion since the divorce was particularly bad that night, made worse by the complete absence of the city sounds she'd grown accustomed to. No traffic, no sirens, no late-night conversations drifting up from the street below. Just an endless crushing quiet that seemed to press against her eardrums. Finally, around 2 in the morning, she'd given up on sleep entirely. She'd dressed quietly in hiking boots and a heavy jacket, left a note for her parents explaining that she'd gone for a walk and would be back before sunrise, and slipped out into the night. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and her breath formed clouds in the moonlit air as she made her way to the trail system that began just behind the cabin. She knew the main trails well from previous visits, but in her agitated state, she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere in the darkness. What should have been a familiar loop back to the cabin became an increasingly steep and rocky path that seemed to wind deeper into the mountains rather than circling back toward civilization. She'd walked for what felt like hours, the beam of her small flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead of her feet, before finally admitting to herself that she was completely lost. The realization had brought with it the first real stab of fear. She was alone in thousands of acres of wilderness, with no way to call for help and no clear idea of which direction would lead her back to safety. The night air was getting colder, and she could feel her body heat leaching away through her jacket. Hypothermia was a real possibility if she couldn't find shelter soon. That's when she'd seen the light through the trees. Not the harsh white glare of a security light, but a warm yellow glow that spoke of human habitation and warmth. She'd pushed through the underbrush toward it, branches catching at her jacket and scratching her face, driven by a desperate need to reach that beacon of hope in the darkness. The cabin that Samantha found in the small clearing was unlike any of the other mountain retreats she'd seen in the area. Where most were simple log structures designed for basic comfort, this one was clearly the product of serious money and careful planning. The exterior was finished in rich oak planking that gleamed in the porch light, and through the large windows she could see expensive furniture and what appeared to be state-of-the-art electronics. More importantly, the front door was standing wide open, spilling warm light out onto the small wooden porch. It was an invitation she couldn't resist in her cold and frightened state. Surely whoever lived here would understand her situation and be willing to help a lost hiker find her way back to civilization. At the very least, they might let her warm up for a few minutes before pointing her in the right direction. She'd called out a greeting as she approached the porch, not wanting to startle anyone who might be inside. When no one answered, she'd called again, louder this time. Still nothing. But the lights were on, and she thought she could hear the faint sound of a television or radio playing somewhere in the depths of the house. Someone was definitely home. They just hadn't heard her over whatever they were watching. The interior of the cabin was even more impressive than the exterior had suggested. The living room featured a massive stone fireplace with a gas insert, surrounded by leather furniture that looked like it had come straight from an expensive showroom. The kitchen was equipped with commercial-grade appliances and granite countertops that probably cost more than most people made in a year. A huge flat-screen television dominated one wall, currently displaying what appeared to be a nature documentary with the sound turned low. Samantha had settled onto the leather couch to wait, grateful for the warmth and the chance to rest her aching feet. The hiking boots she'd chosen were more suited to short walks than extended treks through rough terrain, and she could feel blisters forming on her heels. She'd been sitting there for perhaps 5 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching from what she assumed was a bedroom or bathroom somewhere else in the house. The man who appeared in the living room doorway was probably in his early 30s, dressed casually in jeans and a blue hoodie. At first glance, he seemed normal enough. Average height, brown hair, the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make him invisible in a crowd. But there was something about him that immediately set Samantha's nerves on edge. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was the way he moved, she realized as she watched him cross the room. His gait was slightly off, as if he wasn't quite comfortable in his own body. His arms swung at odd angles, and his head seemed to bob with each step in a way that reminded her of a marionette being operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. When he smiled at her, the expression didn't reach his eyes, and those eyes never quite met hers directly. "You look cold," he said, his voice pleasant enough but somehow flat, as if he were reading lines from a script. "Let me get you something warm to drink, and a blanket." Samantha had started to explain her situation, how she'd gotten lost on the trails, how she just needed directions back to Pine Ridge or at least to the main road, but he'd waved off her words with a dismissive gesture. "Plenty of time for that," he'd said, still not looking directly at her. "First, we need to get you warmed up. Can't have you catching pneumonia out there in the cold." He'd disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Samantha alone with her growing sense of unease. Everything about this situation felt wrong, but she couldn't identify exactly why. The man seemed friendly enough, even if his mannerisms were a bit odd. The cabin was clearly legitimate. You couldn't fake the kind of expensive fixtures and furniture she saw around her, and she was genuinely lost and in need of help. But something primitive in her brain was screaming warnings at her, some ancient survival instinct that had kept her ancestors alive through countless dangers. Every cell in her body was telling her to get up and walk out of that cabin immediately, to take her chances in the cold wilderness rather than stay another moment in this warm, comfortable prison. When the man returned from the kitchen, he was carrying a steaming mug and what appeared to be a detailed topographic map of the area. The gesture seemed thoughtful, exactly what she would have expected from someone genuinely trying to help a lost hiker. But his behavior remained unnervingly strange. He set the mug on the coffee table in front of her and spread the map out beside it, but instead of sitting down to help her locate her position, he simply stood there watching her with that unsettling, indirect gaze. "Drink up," he said, gesturing toward the mug. It's a special herbal blend. Very warming. The tea, when Samantha lifted it to her lips, had an odd color. Not quite brown, not quite green, but something in between that reminded her of stagnant pond water. The smell was even worse, a combination of bitterness and something else she couldn't identify, something that made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. But the man was still standing there, still watching her with that false smile, and she felt an irrational pressure to drink it rather than offend him. The first sip was worse than she'd expected. The liquid was indeed warm, but the taste was so bitter it made her eyes water. There was an underlying flavor beneath the bitterness, something sweet and cloying that reminded her of overripe fruit on the verge of rot. She forced herself to swallow, then set the mug back down on the table. It's very distinctive, she managed, trying to be polite while fighting back the urge to gag. The man's smile widened, but it still looked like a mask rather than a genuine expression of pleasure. My grandmother's recipe, he said. She always said it could cure whatever ailed you. He finally moved away from her then, walking toward what appeared to be a hallway leading to the back of the cabin. I'll just get you that blanket, he called over his shoulder. Make yourself comfortable. But instead of disappearing down the hallway as she'd expected, he stopped just at the edge of the living room and turned back to watch her. The pressure of his gaze felt almost physical, and Samantha found herself reaching for the mug again despite her revulsion. She took another sip, then another, driven by some combination of politeness and an inexplicable compulsion she couldn't understand. With each swallow, the taste seemed to change slightly, becoming more palatable even as her vision began to blur around the edges. The expensive living room started to take on a dreamlike quality, the colors becoming more vivid while the shapes became less distinct. She tried to stand, thinking dimly that she needed to leave immediately, but her legs felt like they were made of water. The last thing she remembered clearly was the sound of the mug hitting the hardwood floor as it slipped from her nerveless fingers. The man was moving toward her, but his approach seemed to take forever, as if he were walking through thick liquid. His face was changing as he came closer, the features becoming more pronounced, more angular, until it looked less like a human face and more like something carved from wood by an artist who had only heard descriptions of what people were supposed to look like. Then everything went black, and she tumbled into a darkness deeper than any sleep she'd ever experienced. When consciousness returned, it came slowly and accompanied by a disorientation so complete that for several minutes Samantha couldn't remember who she was, let alone where she was. The darkness around her was absolute, more complete than anything she'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if light had never existed, as if she'd awakened in a void where the very concept of illumination was foreign. Gradually, her other senses began to function again. She was lying on something soft, a couch or bed, and she could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded her of decomposing leaves. There were sounds around her, quiet breathing, the soft rustle of fabric, and occasionally a muffled sob or whisper. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to make out shapes around her. The room she was in appeared to be the same living room where she'd lost consciousness, but something was fundamentally different about it. The expensive furniture was still there, but it seemed faded somehow, as if she were looking at it through a dark filter. The large windows that had been so prominent before were now just rectangles of slightly lighter darkness, offering no view of the outside world. More disturbing was the realization that she was not alone. As her vision improved, she could make out the forms of other people scattered around the room, some sitting on furniture, others huddled on the floor. When she tried to count them, she got different numbers each time, as if the shadows were playing tricks on her perception. But she was certain there were at least 7 or 8 other people in the room with her, all of them as confused and frightened as she was. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice sounding strange and hollow in the unnatural quiet. A young girl's voice answered from somewhere to her left. "You're awake. We were starting to worry about you." The voice belonged to someone very young, maybe 11 or 12 years old, and it carried a tremor of fear that made Samantha's heart race. "Where are we?" Samantha asked, struggling to sit up. Her body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if she were moving underwater. "Same place you were before," said another voice, this one belonging to an adult woman. "But it's different now. Everything's different. As the others began to speak, Samantha learned that they all had similar stories. Each had found the cabin under different circumstances, some lost like her, others seeking help for various emergencies. But all had been offered the bitter tea by the strange man with the jerky movements and unnatural gait. All had lost consciousness after drinking it, and all had awakened here in this transformed version of the same room. But it was more than just transformed. As Samantha explored the space with increasingly desperate movements, she discovered that the cabin had become something impossible. The doors that had led to other rooms were simply gone, not locked or blocked, but absent entirely, as if they had never existed. The walls were solid where doorways should have been, the wood grain flowing uninterrupted across spaces that had definitely contained openings just hours before. The kitchen was still accessible, but when she investigated it, she found all the drawers and cabinets completely empty. Not just empty of food or dishes, but empty of everything. No utensils, no cleaning supplies, no signs that the kitchen had ever been used for its intended purpose. Even more disturbing, when she tried the faucet, nothing came out. No water, no sound of pipes, nothing at all. The temperature in the room was neither warm nor cold, but somehow wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. It was as if the very air around them had been replaced with something that only resembled air, something that kept them alive but felt alien in their lungs. When she breathed deeply, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was inhaling something that was fundamentally different from the atmosphere she'd known all her life. The first disappearance happened while they were still trying to understand their situation. One of the men, a middle-aged guy in hiking gear who said his name was Gary, had been growing increasingly agitated as the hours passed. He kept walking to the front door and pressing his ear against it as if listening for something on the other side. When the others asked what he was doing, he'd just shaken his head and muttered about needing to check something. It was around what Samantha estimated to be their 4th or 5th hour in the transformed cabin when Gary finally opened that door. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything from the natural world. Instead of the forest clearing that should have been outside, there was only darkness, but not the normal darkness of night. This was something alive and moving, a substance that seemed to have weight and purpose. The dark mass pressed against the doorframe like a liquid, but it moved with deliberate intent rather than flowing according to gravity. It pulsed and shifted, occasionally revealing glimpses of something that might have been light deep within its depths. Not illumination exactly, but brief flashes of color that had no names in any human language Samantha knew. Gary stood transfixed in the doorway, staring into that impossible darkness with an expression of wonder and terror. When the others called to him, begging him to close the door and step back, he didn't seem to hear them. He was leaning forward slightly, as if the darkness were pulling at him with invisible hands. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's singing to me." Samantha couldn't hear any singing, but she could feel something emanating from the dark mass. A kind of psychic pressure that made her think of deep ocean trenches and the spaces between stars. It was calling to something primitive in her brain, something that wanted to step forward and let the darkness embrace her. Before any of them could stop him, Gary took a step forward into the darkness. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the mass surged upward and around him like a living thing. For just an instant, Samantha saw his face through the translucent darkness, his expression shifting from wonder to absolute terror as he realized what was happening to him. Then he was gone. Not just absorbed, but somehow erased, as if he had never existed at all. The darkness settled back to its previous level, pressing gently against the doorframe, but making no attempt to enter the cabin. It was content to wait, patient as a spider in its web. The young girl, her name was Lily, Samantha learned, began to scream when Gary vanished. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of human terror, a primal shriek that spoke of every nightmare that had ever haunted a child's sleep. The others tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to be given. They had all seen something that defied every law of physics and reason they understood. More disturbing than Gary's disappearance was the way the rest of them reacted to it. Within an hour, they had all begun to stare at the darkness with the same expression of longing that had preceded Gary's destruction. They couldn't help themselves. The thing outside the door was calling to them in ways that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something deep in their subconscious minds. Samantha found herself walking to the windows and pressing her hands against the glass, trying to get closer to the darkness that pressed against the other side. The glass was burning hot, so hot that it should have blistered her skin instantly, but somehow it didn't hurt. She could feel the heat, could understand intellectually that it was dangerous, but the sensation felt distant and unimportant compared to the hypnotic pull of the darkness beyond. Time became meaningless in the transformed cabin. Samantha tried to keep track of the hours by counting her heartbeats, but even that became unreliable as her pulse seemed to slow and quicken according to no pattern she could understand. None of them felt hunger or thirst, despite what must have been days passing. They didn't need to use the bathroom, didn't feel the normal physiological needs that should have driven them to desperation in such circumstances. It was as if their bodies had been placed in some kind of suspended animation, maintained at a basic level of function, but no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. They were becoming something else, something that could exist in this impossible space between reality and nightmare. The psychological effects were even more disturbing than the physical ones. One by one, the other people in the cabin began to lose coherent thought. They would sit for hours staring at nothing, their eyes unfocused and their faces slack. When spoken to, they would respond with nonsensical phrases or simply repeat the last thing they had heard. The woman who had first spoken to Samantha when she woke up, she called herself Maria, was the second to succumb to the darkness outside. She had been sitting by the window for what felt like an entire day, pressing her face against the burning glass and whispering to something she claimed she could see moving within the dark mass. "It knows my name," she said when Samantha tried to pull her away from the window. "It's been waiting for me all my life. I have to go to it." Before anyone could stop her, Maria had walked calmly to the door and opened it. The darkness embraced her with what almost looked like tenderness, wrapping around her slowly and gently. She smiled as it consumed her, her face showing relief rather than terror. When she was gone, the others barely reacted. They were already too far gone to register the loss of another human being. Samantha tried desperately to maintain her sanity and her sense of self. She repeated her own name over and over again, clinging to the sound of it like a lifeline. She recited her address, her phone number, the names of her family members, anything that connected her to the world outside this nightmare. But even these anchors felt increasingly fragile as the hours passed. The young girl, Lily, seemed to be resisting the psychological dissolution better than the adults, but she was paying a terrible price for her clarity. She cried constantly, not the normal tears of a frightened child, but something that looked more like blood mixed with water. Her small body shook with tremors that never stopped, and she flinched away from any attempt at comfort. "I want my mommy," she whispered repeatedly, the words becoming a kind of mantra that seemed to be the only thing keeping her grounded in reality. Samantha tried to comfort her, but she was fighting her own battle against the strange lethargy that was settling over her mind like a heavy blanket. Every thought required enormous effort, and she found herself forgetting things constantly. What she had been doing moments before, what she had been trying to say, sometimes even where she was. The darkness outside seemed to be learning from each person it consumed. After Maria's disappearance, it began to pulse with a different rhythm, and Samantha could swear she could hear voices within it, Gary's voice and Maria's voice, calling out to the remaining survivors, begging them to join them in the beautiful darkness where there was no pain and no fear. By the time only 3 of them remained, Samantha, Lily, and a quiet woman who had never told them her name, the cabin itself had begun to change in more dramatic ways. The furniture was becoming transparent, as if it were slowly fading out of existence. The walls grew thin enough that they could see the darkness pressing against them from all sides, not just through the windows and the door. Samantha realized with growing horror that the cabin wasn't a refuge from the darkness. It was bait, a trap designed to hold them while the darkness slowly digested their reality around them. Eventually, there would be nothing left but the darkness itself, and they would have no choice but to become part of it. She tried to explain this to the others, but the unnamed woman just stared at her with vacant eyes and smiled. "It doesn't matter," she said in a dreamy voice. "Nothing matters anymore. We're already dead. We just don't know it yet." That was when Samantha understood that she was truly alone. Lily was still conscious, still fighting, but she was just a child with no understanding of what was happening to them. The responsibility for their survival fell entirely on Samantha's shoulders, and she had no idea how to carry it. In desperation, she began to search the increasingly insubstantial cabin for anything that might help them escape. The kitchen drawers had been empty before, but now they were beginning to merge with the countertops, becoming part of a seamless whole that defied the basic concepts of separate objects. The television had vanished entirely, and the expensive furniture was becoming ghostly outlines of itself. It was while she was searching behind the couch that she made a discovery that filled her with both hope and terror. There were deep gouges in the floor, as if something extremely heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. The marks led from behind the couch to the front door, and they were fresh, made recently, possibly within the last few hours. As she traced the gouges with her fingers, she realized what they meant. The unnamed woman had been trying to drag her toward the door while she slept. Not just her, but Lily as well, and probably the couch they were sitting on. She had been planning to deliver them all to the darkness in one final offering. The woman was standing by the door now, her hand on the knob, smiling that vacant smile. "It's time," she said gently. "Time to go home." Samantha didn't think. She threw herself across the room and tackled the woman just as she began to turn the door handle. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, but the woman was surprisingly strong for someone who appeared to be in a trance. She fought back with desperate fury, scratching at Samantha's face and trying to bite her hands. "You don't understand," she hissed, her vacant expression replaced by something wild and desperate. "We have to go. It's calling us. We can't stay here anymore." The struggle seemed to last forever, but eventually Samantha managed to pin the woman down long enough to grab Lily and pull her away from the door. But even as she did, she could feel the pull of the darkness herself. It was stronger now, more insistent, and she could hear the voices of all the people who had been consumed calling out to her in harmony. The unnamed woman broke free and stumbled toward the door, fumbling with the handle. This time, Samantha didn't try to stop her. She was too busy fighting her own desire to follow, her own need to step into that beautiful darkness and let it wash away all her pain and fear and confusion. The woman opened the door and walked into the darkness with a sigh of relief. The mass embraced her eagerly, and for a moment Samantha could see all of their faces within it. Gary and Maria and the woman whose name she'd never learned, all of them peaceful and smiling and beckoning for her to join them. But she didn't join them. Instead, she grabbed Lily and ran toward the back of the cabin, hoping against hope that there might be another way out. The walls were almost completely transparent now, and she could see the darkness pressing in from all sides, but there was still a small area near what had once been a bathroom that seemed more solid than the rest. She threw her shoulder against the wall there and felt it give way like wet cardboard. Beyond it was another kind of darkness, not the living, hungry darkness that had consumed the others, but the normal darkness of a forest at night. She could see stars through the canopy of trees, and she could smell pine and earth and all the normal scents of the natural world. Without hesitation, she pushed Lily through the opening and followed her into the blessed reality of the ordinary forest. Behind them, the cabin was collapsing in on itself, the walls folding inward like a house of cards, until there was nothing left but a small clearing where nothing grew. They ran through the forest until they found a trail, and followed the trail until they reached the main road. A passing motorist picked them up and drove them to the police station, where Samantha tried to explain what had happened. The officers were kind but skeptical, and when they investigated the area she described, they found no trace of any cabin or clearing. Lily was returned to her family, who had been searching for her for 3 days. She never spoke about what had happened in the cabin, and within a few weeks she seemed to have forgotten it entirely. Children, Samantha learned, are remarkably resilient in the face of trauma that would destroy an adult's sanity. But Samantha never forgot. She couldn't forget. The memory of that place, and what it had done to the people trapped there, haunted her every dream and followed her through every waking hour. She moved to a different state, changed her phone number, and tried to rebuild her life, but she could never escape the knowledge that somewhere in the Colorado mountains there was a darkness that was still waiting, still hungry, still calling out to anyone who might be foolish enough to listen. That's why she couldn't come to my cabin. That's why she would never again venture into the deep woods where the darkness might be lurking, patient as a spider in its web, ready to welcome the next lost soul into its eternal embrace. The dense forest closed in around me as I hiked deeper into the heart of the Michigan wilderness, my boots crunching through the thick carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. I adjusted the heavy pack on my back, feeling the weight of the survival gear and supplies I'd need for this secret mission. When I first got the cryptic message about this off-the-books government job, I was desperate enough to take it without asking too many questions. Money had been tight ever since I got out of the Army. This gig promised a big payday if I could track down and retrieve some classified material that had gone missing in these remote woods. They needed someone with my background in reconnaissance and survival. But now, miles from civilization, an uneasy feeling prickled the back of my neck, like I was being watched by unseen eyes in the shadows of the towering evergreens. I quickened my pace, wanting to make camp before nightfall. As a kid growing up in Milwaukee, I'd heard all the old stories and folklore about strange things that lived in the ancient forests of the upper Midwest, things that didn't appreciate humans intruding in their domain. I shook my head, trying to dispel the irrational fears. I was a trained professional, not some gullible bumpkin spooked by tall tales. Still, I couldn't quite shake the sense that I wasn't alone out here, that I was an intruder who wasn't welcome. The sun dipped below the horizon, the forest rapidly darkening beneath the dense canopy. I needed to stop for the night. I found a small clearing and unslung my pack, pulling out my tent and survival stove. As I set up camp, I reviewed the mission brief in my head. Somewhere in this sprawling wilderness, a government field team had gone radio silent while transporting a package marked maximum classified. My job was to locate any survivors and secure that package, contents unknown. I didn't like operating without all the facts, but I needed this job. The pay would get me back on my feet, let me breathe a little easier. I finished setting up my modest camp and heated up an MRE for dinner. As I sat by the small fire, the night pressed in close, a living darkness that felt heavy with secrets. The normal sounds of nature, the hooting owls and chirping crickets, seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly a twig snapped in the underbrush, freakishly loud in the oppressive silence. I jumped to my feet, pulling my sidearm from its holster, my heart pounding. I peered into the inky shadows between the trees but saw nothing. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out. No response, just that same weighted silence. I knew I should put out the fire, take cover in my tent, but some reckless part of me, the part that had spent too long in war zones, needed to know what was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached the tree line. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching strange shapes in its stark illumination, gnarled tree trunks that looked almost human, moss-covered boulders crouched like sleeping beasts. There was nothing there, I told myself, just an overactive imagination. I was about to turn back to camp when the light landed on something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, in the leaf litter just beyond the edge of my camp, was a single pristine military boot. Laces tied, no sign of the foot that belonged in it. The boot was upright, standing on its sole, defying gravity, as if it had been deliberately placed there and was waiting for its owner to return. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the chill in the autumn air. This was all wrong. Something was very wrong with this forest. With a rising sense of dread, I began to wonder if the local folklore I'd scoffed at was more than just stories, and if I had walked into something I didn't understand. I suddenly wondered if the missing government team had run afoul of something best left undisturbed in these ancient woods, and now I was alone out here with it. I barely slept that night, startling awake at every noise in the darkened forest around me. The waiting boot haunted my thoughts. It had to be connected to the missing team I was sent to find. But how? And why leave it there like some kind of unsettling message? At first light, I broke camp, desperate to complete my mission and get out of these eerie woods. I hiked in the direction the boot had been pointing, a strange hunch telling me it was a clue. As I trekked deeper into the wilderness, the sense of being watched only intensified. I caught flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was never anything there, just the endless green of the forest and the sound of my own labored breathing. Around midday, I stumbled into another clearing and stopped short. There, arranged in a perfect circle, were a dozen more boots, all in the same pristine condition, standing on their soles like strange monuments. My heart raced as I approached the circle. Each boot was a different size and style, from combat boots to hiking shoes. Did they represent the missing team? There were men's and women's shoes. Had the whole unit disappeared? I searched the clearing for any other clues but found nothing. No sign of a struggle. No discarded gear. Just those damn boots standing sentinel. I pulled out my satellite phone, ready to report this unsettling discovery, but I had no signal. Of course. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I was a rational man. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the team had to abandon their boots for some reason. Maybe this was all part of some training exercise and I was getting worked up over nothing. But deep down, I knew something far stranger was at work. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with the certainty that I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. Something that belonged to the world of myth and folklore, not military secrets. I had to keep moving, complete my objective. I left the clearing and the uncanny boot circle behind, pushing further into the forest. The trees grew older, taller, their canopy blocking out more and more of the sunlight until I felt like I was walking through an eternal twilight. I consulted my map and compass, making sure I was still on course. As I looked back up from the map, I froze. There, in the middle of the game trail ahead of me, was a single combat boot lying on its side, as if it had been tossed there carelessly by its vanished owner. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get out of this forest. But I had a mission. Slowly, I approached the boot. I had to know if it held any answers. I crouched down, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the boot. Just before my fingers touched the leather, the boot moved. It rocked slightly, then flipped itself upright, as if yanked by an invisible string, making me scramble back with a yelp of shock. The boot began to march forward of its own accord, heading deeper into the woods. It was impossible. It defied everything I knew about the world. But here I was, watching a lone boot stride purposefully into the forest. Some crazy impulse seized me and I found myself following after the boot, my heart hammering in my chest. I kept a safe distance but matched its pace, letting it lead me to who knew where. As I trailed the uncanny boot through the shadowed woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into the heart of something ancient and powerful, a force that had lured countless men and women into its domain over the centuries, never to be seen again. And now I was to be the latest sacrifice to its hungry isolation. As I followed the marching boot deeper into the forest, my mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Every rational part of me insisted this was impossible. Boots don't move on their own. There had to be some trick, some clever bit of stagecraft designed to unsettle me. But another part of me, the part that had heard all those old legends growing up, whispered that there were things in this world that defied rational explanations. Ancient things, powerful things, that modern man had forgotten, but still lurked in the wild places of the earth. The boot continued its relentless forward motion, never faltering, never slowing. It moved with a purpose, as if called by some unseen force. I followed, arms slick with fierce sweat despite the autumn chill, breath coming in shallow gasps. What was I doing? Why didn't I turn around, go back the way I came? But I knew I couldn't. Not without answers, not without finding out what happened to the team I was sent to locate. Their fate was tied to this impossible boot, I was certain of it. So I pressed on, tracking the boot as the forest grew darker and more twisted around us. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and deformed, branches twisting into unnatural shapes. They seemed to lean in towards the narrow game trail, blocking out the sky, trapping me in a claustrophobic tunnel of wood and shadow. I thought back to the old stories I'd heard as a kid, tales passed down from my grandfather who'd been a logger in the North Woods. Stories of men who ventured too deep into the forest and came back changed, if they came back at all. Men who claimed to have seen impossible creatures, who spoke of trees that moved when you weren't looking, and strange lights that danced in the night sky. As a child, I'd thrilled to those stories, begging my grandfather to tell them again and again. But as I grew older, I dismissed them as simple folklore, the product of isolation and overactive imaginations. Now, following a boot marching itself through a darkened forest, those stories didn't seem so fanciful anymore. The boot suddenly veered off the game trail, heading into the thick underbrush. I hesitated, looking at the dense wall of foliage, but I knew I had to follow. I couldn't lose the boot, not when it was my only lead. I pushed through the brush, thorns catching at my clothes, branches slapping my face. The boot was just ahead, moving easily through the tangled growth as if the forest itself was parting to let it pass. I stumbled out into another clearing and pulled up short. The boot had stopped in the center of the open space. As I watched, it began to move in a slow circle, as if pacing out the dimensions of the clearing. Then, to my horror, more boots began to emerge from the trees ringing the clearing. Dozens of them, all marching on their own, all converging on the clearing like some grotesque gathering. They formed a ring around the perimeter, a macabre audience waiting for some unholy show to begin. In the center, the first boot was joined by a second, then a third. They began to move together, marching in intricate patterns, their steps forming strange sigils on the forest floor. I watched, my breath caught in my throat as the boots danced their eerie ballet. It was hypnotic, mesmerizing, the rhythmic thump of their steps echoing in the unnatural silence of the forest. Some distant, rational part of me screamed that I should run, that I should flee this impossible scene. But I was rooted to the spot, transfixed by the boots' macabre performance. Then, as suddenly as it began, the dance stopped. The boots were once again standing in a perfect circle in the clearing's center. And in that moment of stillness, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. In the center of the circle, the earth was moving, stirring as if something were pushing up from beneath, fighting its way out of the soil. The leaves and dirt shifted, then parted as a hand burst forth from the ground, pale and caked with grave soil, but unmistakably human. A scream lodged in my throat as I watched a figure claw its way out of the forest floor, sloughing off dirt, rising to stand in the center of the ring of boots. It was dressed in the tattered remains of a military uniform, its skin pale and gray. As the figure turned towards me, I saw its face was a ruin, features rotted away, eye sockets dark and hollow. But I recognized the name patch on its chest. It belonged to the commander of the missing unit I'd been sent to find. The thing that had once been a man opened its mouth and a sound emerged, a guttural moan that held an age of sorrow and hunger. And as that terrible sound echoed through the clearing, the boots began to move again, marching towards me with unholy purpose. As the reanimated corpse of the unit's commander lurched towards me, I finally broke free of my paralysis. Blind panic overtook me and I turned to run, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate bid to escape the nightmarish scene behind me. Branches tore at my face and arms as I ran, but I barely felt them. All I could focus on was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that thing in the clearing, my commander returned from the dead. But even as I fled, my mind reeled, trying to process what I had seen. The marching boots, the resurrected corpse. It defied all reason, all laws of nature. How was this possible? What dark power could reanimate the dead, could control inanimate objects like macabre puppets? I thought back to the old stories, tales of creatures that could shape reality to their whims, blur the line between life and death. Beings older than humanity, powerful and inscrutable. Had the missing unit stumbled across such an entity? As I ran, I reviewed what I knew, trying to piece together a complete picture. The unit had been transporting classified material. Had that been some artifact, some relic tied to these ancient beings? Had they awakened something that should have stayed buried? My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I pushed on, driven by a primal need to escape, to survive. Behind me I could hear the sounds of pursuit, the relentless marching of many feet. But it wasn't just the undead commander chasing me. To my horror, I realized it was the boots, the entire uncanny army of them, and they were gaining ground. I spotted a light ahead through the trees, a campfire. Hope flared in my chest. A ranger station, another hiker, someone who could help. I put on a burst of speed, crashing through the last of the underbrush into a small clearing. But the hope died as quickly as it had risen. The clearing was empty save for a single tent and a dying campfire. No, not quite empty. Arrayed around the campfire like some obscene audience were boots, dozens of them, waiting. I skidded to a halt, my heart in my throat. I was surrounded, the boots closing in from all sides. There was nowhere left to run. As the undead commander and his army of boots emerged from the trees, I truly understood the depths of the horror I was facing. This was no mere monster, no simple undead creature. This was something far older, far more powerful, a force that could bend the laws of life and death, of reality itself. I had stumbled into its domain, trespassed where humans were not meant to walk, and now, like countless others before me lured into these ancient woods, I would pay the price. The commander's corpse shuffled closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Up close, I could see the rot, the exposed bones, the empty sockets where eyes once sat. It reached for me with skeletal hands, and I knew my fate was sealed. As the boots closed in, as cold, dead fingers brushed my face, a scream finally tore loose from my throat, echoing through the forest. But there was no one to hear it, no one to help. In that moment, as the commander's corpse pulled me into its embrace, and the boots began to march once more, I finally understood the true nature of the ancient power in this forest. It was a hunger, a need to consume, to subsume all life into its eternal, soulless dance. And I was to be its latest meal, my life, my very essence, fuel for its endless, uncanny performance in the depths of these primordial woods. The last thing I saw as the boots marched over me, burying me in their relentless rhythm, was the night sky above the clearing, stars cold and distant. So beautiful, so unreachable. Then the boots closed over my head, and I knew no more, just the endless sound of marching, marching, marching into oblivion. Darkness. Utter, complete darkness. That was all I knew, all I could comprehend. Was this death? Was this what lay beyond that final veil, just an eternity of black? But no, death would be a mercy, a release. And as sensation slowly returned to me, I knew I had not been granted that mercy. I could feel the cold earth beneath me, the damp soil pressing in on all sides. I was underground, buried, but still somehow, impossibly, alive. Panic seized me and I thrashed, trying to claw my way out of my earthen prison. But the soil was packed tight, unyielding. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was trapped, entombed in the very earth itself. Just as I felt the last of my air expelled from my lungs, just as I was sure I would finally succumb, I felt it. A presence, ancient and powerful, all around me. It was in the soil, in the roots that twined around my limbs, in the very worms that crawled through the dirt. And it was in me. I could feel it seeping into my skin, my muscles, my bones. It was a force of nature, primordial and uncaring, and it was claiming me, making me part of itself. With that realization came understanding. The boots, the undead commander, they were mere expressions of this force, vessels for its power. It was the forest itself, a living, sentient thing, older than humanity, older than thought. I had not been buried. I had been planted. Like a seed, I was being nourished, grown, transformed into something new, something that was no longer entirely human. The presence invaded my mind, my memories. I saw flashes of the countless others who had been taken by the forest over the centuries, hikers, explorers, soldiers, all subsumed into its eternal being. I saw the role I was to play, the purpose for which I had been chosen. I was to be its agent, its emissary. I would walk again, not as a man, but as an extension of the forest's will. I would lure others into its embrace, feed its endless hunger. Just as I had been lured. As this terrible knowledge filled me, I felt my body changing, warping to the forest's design. My skin hardened, grew bark-like. My fingers elongated into twisting roots. I could feel the sap running through my veins, the slow, inexorable pulse of the forest itself. And then, with a shuddering gasp, I was rising, clawing my way out of the earth, born anew. I stood shakily, unused to my new form. I was taller, stronger, no longer constrained by the limits of mere human flesh. Around me, the forest whispered its welcome, its approval. I was one with it now, a child of root and soil. The last vestiges of my humanity had been stripped away, replaced by something ancient, something green and growing. I looked down at my hands, seeing the rough, bark-like skin, the elongated fingers. I flexed them, marveling at the strength, the power that flowed through me, the power of the forest itself. In the distance, through the trees, I could see a campfire, smell the sweet scent of human flesh. The forest's hunger, my hunger, stirred. It was time to feed. I took a step forward, then another. The boots, my loyal soldiers, fell in behind me, marching to the forest's implacable rhythm. I had work to do, and all of eternity to do it in. The forest had claimed me, and through me, it would claim others. Such was the cycle, older than time itself. The forest would always hunger, and I, its faithful servant, would always provide. I moved through the forest, my steps silent on the loam, leaving no trace of my passage. The trees whispered to me, guiding me towards my prey. I could feel their presence, the warm flicker of their lives, like candles in the dark. So fragile, so easily extinguished. As I approached the campsite, I could hear their voices, the soft murmur of conversation. They were oblivious, unaware of the fate that awaited them, just as I had once been. I remembered my own journey into these woods, the mission that had brought me here. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a memory belonging to someone else, someone human. That man had died the moment the forest claimed him, buried him in its damp embrace. Now, I was something new, something that walked between the world of men and the realm of root and soil. I was the forest's emissary, its lure and its maw. Through me, it would feed, as it had for eons. I emerged from the trees, stepping into the flickering light of the campfire. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all wearing the uniform of the Ranger Service. They looked up as I approached, their eyes widening in surprise and alarm. I knew what they saw. A figure, tall and gaunt, clad in the tattered remnants of a military uniform. A face that was no longer entirely human, skin rough and bark-like, eyes as green and deep as the forest itself. What are you?" one of the men stammered, reaching for the rifle propped against a log. I smiled, and it was the smile of the forest, ancient and hungry. "I am the end," I said, my voice rustling like wind through leaves, "and the beginning. I am the cycle, eternal and unchanging." Behind me, the boots emerged from the darkness, marching in perfect unison. They formed a circle around the campsite, trapping the rangers inside. There would be no escape, no mercy. The rangers stared in horror at the spectral army, their faces pale in the firelight. They didn't understand, couldn't comprehend the power they faced. To them, this was a nightmare, a terror that defied all reason. But to me, it was truth, the only truth that mattered. The truth of the forest, of the force that moved through all living things, consuming them, changing them. The force that had remade me in its image. I stepped forward, my hand outstretched. "Come," I said, my voice a whisper that carried the weight of centuries. "Come and be one with the eternal green. Come and feed the hunger that never dies." The rangers recoiled, terror etched on their faces. They raised their weapons, their fingers trembling on the triggers. But it was futile, a gesture of defiance as meaningless as a candle before a hurricane. I felt the forest surge through me, its power crackling in my veins. The air shimmered, and the rangers' weapons turned to dust in their hands, crumbling away like dead leaves. They stared at their empty palms, their eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cheek of the nearest ranger. He shuddered at my touch, his skin blistering, peeling away to reveal the green beneath. The forest was claiming him, as it had claimed me, as it claimed all who ventured into its domain. One by one I touched them, and one by one they changed, their bodies warping, twisting into new forms. They screamed, but their screams turned to rustling whispers, to the creaking of branches and the groaning of ancient wood. In moments, it was done. Where 3 humans had stood, now there were 3 trees, their branches reaching towards the night sky, their roots burrowing deep into the loam. They had been consumed, subsumed, made part of the eternal forest. I stood amidst them, feeling the pulse of the forest, the thrum of its ancient power. I was its child, its servant, and its instrument. Through me, it would grow, it would spread, until all the world was one vast primeval wood. The boots gathered around me, awaiting my command. I turned, facing the depths of the forest, feeling its call in my bones. There was much work to be done, much hunger to be sated. I stepped into the darkness, the boots marching behind me, and the forest swallowed us whole, welcoming us into its timeless embrace. As I moved through the forest, the trees parted before me like loyal subjects bowing to their king. I could feel their reverence, their recognition of the power that now dwelled within me. I was part of them, and they were part of me, all of us woven into the vast primordial tapestry of the forest. To understand the profound change I had undergone, it's important to grasp the true nature of the forest. This was no ordinary woodland, no simple collection of trees and plants and animals. It was a living entity, a being of immense power and ancient hunger. Imagine, if you will, a vast, interconnected web of life, where every root and branch and leaf is but a cell in a greater organism. That is the forest. It thinks, it feels, it hungers, and it grows, always seeking to expand its domain. For centuries, perhaps longer, it has lured creatures into its depths, consuming them, absorbing their essence into itself. In this way, it learns, it adapts, it evolves. The boots, the undead soldiers, even the very trees themselves, all are extensions of its will, tools it uses to feed its endless appetite. And now, I had become one such tool. By burying me in its soil, by infusing me with its essence, the forest had remade me, transformed me into a being uniquely suited to serve its needs. I was no longer fully human, but neither was I fully tree. I was something in between, a hybrid creature bridging the gap between the world of flesh and the realm of root and branch. But the transformation went beyond the physical. My mind, my very thoughts, were now intertwined with the forest's own vast, ancient consciousness. I could hear its whispers, feel its desires pulsing through me like sap through a tree's veins. And what it desired, above all else, was to grow, to spread, to consume. That was the purpose it had imprinted upon me, the sacred mission I was now compelled to fulfill. It's a difficult concept for the human mind to grasp, the idea of an individual will being subsumed by a greater, inhuman intelligence. The closest analogy I can offer is that of a hive mind, where the needs of the colony override the desires of the individual. I was still me, still retained my memories and personality, but my goals, my drives, were now aligned with those of the forest. As I walked, I pondered the implications of my new existence. I had been granted power beyond human comprehension, the strength of an ancient oak, the resilience of a hardy weed, the ability to shape and control the very plants around me. But that power came with a price, a responsibility to use it in service of the forest's aims. I knew that I would bring more into the fold, lure more humans into the forest's embrace to be transformed as I had been. In this way, the forest would spread, its influence creeping outward like vines overtaking an abandoned building. And perhaps in time, all the world would be subsumed, all of humanity converted into servants of the eternal green. The thought filled me with a strange mix of awe and horror, of reverence and revulsion. But I banished such concerns from my mind. They were human worries, human fears, and I was human no longer. I was a child of the forest now, and my only concern was to do its bidding. The boots marched behind me, a silent, eerie procession. They were my army now, the forest's army, and together we would bring more into the fold. The forest would grow, and the world would change. Such was the inevitable cycle, the unstoppable march of root and soil. I walked on, deeper into the green, feeling the forest's power thrumming through me with every step. I had found my purpose, my place in the vast, eternal web of life. I was home, and I would make it my mission to bring others home as well, to the forest, to the eternal green. As I walked deeper into the forest, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The transformation was complete. I was one with the ancient woods now, a part of something far greater and more powerful than my human self could have ever conceived. It's hard to put into words the profound sense of belonging I felt, the deep connection to the living, breathing entity that was the forest. Imagine every cell in your body singing in perfect harmony, every thought and impulse aligned towards a single, unified purpose. That's what it was like, a complete merging of self with the vast primordial consciousness of the woods. The forest's thoughts flowed through me like a deep, underground river, carrying with them the wisdom of eons. I saw flashes of the countless beings it had absorbed over the centuries, animals, plants, humans, all of them now part of the great, interconnected web of life that sprawled beneath the ancient canopy. I understood now that the forest wasn't malevolent, wasn't evil in the way a human might understand the concept. It was simply following its nature, enacting the role that had been imprinted into the very fabric of its being. Just as a wolf hunts to feed its pack, the forest consumed to grow, to spread, to fulfill the imperative coded into its deepest roots. And now, that imperative was my imperative. The boots marched behind me, a tangible manifestation of the forest's will. Together we would bring more into the fold, expand the forest's domain until it encompassed all the world. I emerged from the trees into a wide clearing. The night sky stretched overhead, the stars cold and distant. They seemed so small now, so insignificant compared to the vast, teeming life of the forest. In the center of the clearing, I could sense them. More humans, their life forces flickering like tiny candles in the dark. They were camped for the night, unaware of the fate that awaited them. I approached silently, the boots fanning out behind me. The humans stirred, some primal instinct alerting them to the presence of a predator. They rose, peering into the darkness, their eyes wide with fear. I stepped into the light of their campfire, and I heard their gasps of shock, of terror. They saw me, saw the inhuman creature I had become, and they recoiled. But I felt no anger towards them, no hatred. They were simply ignorant, blind to the true nature of the world around them. They couldn't understand the glory of the forest, the beauty of the eternal cycle of life and death and rebirth. I would make them understand. I would show them the truth, just as it had been shown to me. I raised my hand, and the forest responded. Vines burst from the earth, wrapping around the humans, lifting them into the air. They struggled, they screamed, but it was futile. The forest was too strong, its will too inexorable. One by one, I touched them, and one by one, they changed. Their flesh hardened into bark, their limbs elongated into branches. They became part of the forest, part of the never-ending cycle. As the last of them transformed, I felt a surge of satisfaction, of fulfillment. This was my purpose, my sacred duty. I would continue this work, continue to grow the forest until all the world was green and verdant and eternal. I turned back towards the trees, back towards the heart of the living woods. The boots fell in behind me, an endless procession, a silent army of the forest. I knew there would be challenges ahead, knew that humanity would resist the coming change. They would fight, they would struggle, just as I had struggled. But in the end, it would make no difference. The forest was patient, and it was inevitable. It would wait, it would grow, and in the fullness of time, it would prevail. I was the forest's instrument, its emissary, and its avatar. And I would not rest until its great work was complete, until the whole world was remade in the image of the eternal green. With a final glance at the stars above, I stepped back into the embrace of the living woods, letting the ancient trees enfold me. I was home, and I would bring all of humanity home, to the forest, to the never-ending cycle of life and growth and change. It was my destiny, the forest's destiny, and nothing would stand in our way. My name is Ethan, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a small apartment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I work as a freelance graphic designer. It's not the most lucrative career, especially with the inconsistent work lately. Money has been really tight, and the financial stress has been weighing on me heavily. That's why when my old college buddies Mark and Jason suggested a camping trip to get away from it all for a few days, I jumped at the chance. We hadn't seen each other in a couple years since I moved away from Michigan, where we grew up. A reunion was long overdue. "It'll be just like old times," Mark had said on the phone. We'll head up to that same spot in the UP that we used to go to in college. Drink some beers around the fire, go fishing, not worry about work or money or any of that crap for a while. It sounded perfect. Like most outdoorsy Midwestern guys, camping and hiking were second nature to us. We'd spent countless weekends in the dense woods of northern Michigan and the vast wilderness of the Upper Peninsula. Escaping into nature always helped clear my head. I threw some supplies and gear into my old pickup truck and made the 8-hour drive north. The familiar sight of towering pines and the fresh, earthy scent of the forest immediately soothed my frayed nerves as I pulled into the remote campground. Mark and Jason had already arrived and were setting up the tents. We greeted each other with bear hugs and cracked open cold beers as we got the fire going. The sky darkened, stars blanketed the night, and the only sounds were the crackling flames and crickets chirping. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. But there was something else. An unsettling feeling creeping up my spine that I couldn't quite place. The shadows seemed to flicker ominously just beyond the reach of the firelight. A distant animal cry echoed from deep in the woods, sending a chill through me despite the warm August air. I shook it off, blaming an overactive imagination and one too many beers. If only I had listened to my instincts that night. The next morning dawned crisp and cool. Mist drifted between the trees and dew sparkled on the grass. Mark was already up, prodding the smoldering embers of last night's fire. "Dude, did you hear those crazy animal sounds last night?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of the strong camp coffee. "What do you think that was? A wolf, maybe?" Mark shrugged. "Could be. They've started repopulating this area in recent years. Or maybe a coyote. I thought I heard something moving around out there too. Probably just a raccoon or something," I said. "You worry too much, man. We're in the middle of nowhere. Nothing out here but us and the wildlife. Although..." Mark trailed off. "What?" He hesitated. "Nah, never mind. Just an old campfire story. Forget I mentioned it." I was intrigued now. "Come on, don't hold out on me. What story?" Mark sighed and glanced at Jason, who was still snoring softly in the tent. He lowered his voice to almost a whisper. "There's an old Native American legend about a creature that supposedly lives in these woods. The Ojibwe people called it the Wendigo. It was once a man, a hunter, but one brutally cold winter his entire family starved to death. In desperation, hunger drove him mad, and he ate them. Consumed by an insatiable greed and bloodlust, the Wendigo now wanders the forests, searching for new victims." I let out a low whistle. "Damn, that's dark. Good thing it's just a legend, right?" Mark didn't meet my eyes. "Yeah, just a legend," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Just then, Jason emerged yawning from the tent, breaking the tension. "What's the plan for today, boys?" "I was thinking we could hike over to that old fishing spot we found last time," I suggested. "The one with the waterfall and the big flat boulders, perfect for sunbathing." They readily agreed, and after a quick breakfast, we headed out, Mark leading the way with his GPS. The deeper we trekked into the dense wilderness, the more uneasy I felt. It was deathly silent, with none of the usual bird songs or insect noises you'd expect. About 2 hours into our hike, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree branch just off the path was some sort of charm or talisman, a bundle of bones, fur, and feathers bound together with frayed rope. Guys," I called out nervously, "you might want to see this." Mark and Jason backtracked to where I was standing, staring up at the grotesque ornament. Jason let out a low whistle. "What the hell is that thing?" he asked. "No idea, but I don't like it," I muttered. "Looks like some kind of twisted voodoo shit." Mark stepped closer to inspect it, brow furrowed. He reached out a tentative hand to touch the bones. "Don't," I said sharply. "You don't know what kind of bad juju that thing might have." Mark shot me an incredulous look. "Seriously? You really believe in that superstitious crap?" I shrugged helplessly. "I don't know, man, but after that Wendigo story you told, I'd rather not take any chances." "That reminds me," Jason chimed in. "I've heard about sightings of that creature around here before from a cousin of mine. He swears his buddy encountered it while hunting these woods years ago." "Not you too," Mark said, shaking his head. "I shouldn't have even brought it up. There's no such thing as a Wendigo." "I'm not saying there is," Jason replied, "but you gotta admit there's something off about this forest. It feels wrong somehow." An icy trickle of dread crept down my spine as I glanced around at the two quiet trees towering over us. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but the woods suddenly seemed more sinister, more watchful. Every snapped twig or rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. "Let's just keep moving," I said gruffly, shouldering my pack. "The sooner we get to the fishing spot, the better." We continued on in uneasy silence, unconsciously hurrying our pace. The forest seemed to close in around us, shadows deepening despite the midday sun. The canopy of leaves grew so thick that only the barest slivers of light penetrated through. I nearly jumped out of my skin when a sudden, high-pitched shriek pierced the oppressive stillness. We froze in our tracks, exchanging alarmed glances. "What the fuck was that?" Jason hissed. The shriek came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls. Something large was moving through the brush just out of sight, circling us. "Guys," I whispered hoarsely, my mouth bone dry. A hulking shape exploded out of the undergrowth, a massive brown bear, rearing up on its hind legs with a furious roar. We scattered in opposite directions as it charged. I've never run so fast in my life, pure adrenaline propelling me through the trees. Branches whipped at my face and tore at my clothes as I sprinted blindly. Behind me, I could hear the bear crashing through the forest, Jason's terrified shouts urging me on. I risked a panicked glance over my shoulder, and my heart nearly stopped. The bear had given up chasing me and Jason. It was after Mark. "Mark!" I screamed, skidding to a halt and whirling around. But I had lost sight of both him and the bear in the dense undergrowth. Jason crashed into me from behind, panting heavily. "Where is he?" Jason gasped out. "I don't know, I lost him. That bear, it was chasing him." A blood-curdling scream ripped through the air, followed by a ferocious roar. My stomach turned to ice. Mark was in trouble. Jason and I charged back the way we came, following the sound of thrashing and snarls. We burst into a small clearing, and a scene from a nightmare greeted us. Mark was on the ground, the huge grizzly towering over him. Crimson blood stained its muzzle. Mark wasn't moving. "Hey!" I bellowed, grabbing a large rock and hurling it at the bear. It bounced off its thick hide harmlessly but got the beast's attention. It swung its massive head toward us and let out an enraged growl. Jason pulled out the large hunting knife he always carried and brandished it with shaking hands. I desperately cast about for a weapon of my own and settled on a sturdy fallen branch. We shouted and waved our arms, trying to appear as large and intimidating as possible. The bear hesitated, glancing between us and Mark's prone form, as if deciding which would be easier prey. "Come on, you ugly bastard," I snarled through gritted teeth. "Come and get us." For a heart-stopping moment I thought it would charge, but to my immense relief it gave a final snort of frustration and lumbered off into the brush. We waited until it was out of sight before sprinting to Mark's side. "Mark!" "Oh God, Mark. Talk to me," I babbled, dropping to my knees beside him. His shirt was torn and bloody, deep gashes marring his chest and shoulders where the bear's claws had rent his flesh. But miraculously, his eyes fluttered open. "Holy shit," he croaked. "That was way too close." Jason gave a strained bark of laughter as we carefully helped Mark sit up. "Understatement of the century, dude. I think I aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. My head swam with relief that he was alive, but also rising panic. We were hours into the backcountry with an injured man and no supplies except what we had in our day packs. And that bear was still out there somewhere. "We need to get him back to camp, fast," I said grimly. "Can you stand?" Mark gritted his teeth against the pain and nodded. He looked pale and clammy, his shirt already soaked with blood. I just prayed the bear hadn't severed an artery. Slinging Mark's arms over our shoulders, Jason and I half-carried, half-dragged him back the way we came as quickly as his wounds allowed. But with every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the increasingly menacing woods. Something ancient and evil and hungry. After what seemed like an eternity, we stumbled back into camp on rubbery legs. The sight of our tents and the ashy remains of the fire almost made me weep with relief. As Jason set about cleaning and dressing Mark's injuries with our meager first aid kit, I busied myself building the fire back up, needing the comforting light and warmth to chase away the dread. The sun was rapidly sinking and the temperature dropping. I sank down next to Mark, exhaustion hitting me like a freight train. "I think we should cut this trip short and head into town first thing tomorrow. Get you to a clinic." He nodded wearily, wincing as Jason tied off a bandage. No arguments here. I've had enough of nature for a while. I huffed out a humorless chuckle. You and me both. We decided to sleep in shifts, one of us always keeping watch for the bear's return. Despite my bone-deep fatigue, I volunteered to go first. There was no way I'd be able to rest easy anyway. Not with the memory of that hideous bone talisman and the Wendigo legend still rattling around my brain. Gripping my hatchet tightly, I feeding twigs to the fire and stared out into the gathering darkness, trying to convince myself the flickering shadows were just trees, wondering what other horrors might be lurking, waiting for their chance to strike. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, Jason was shaking me awake. The fire had burned down to embers and the night pressed in close and menacing. "Dude, wake up," he urged in a harsh whisper. "Do you hear that?" I rubbed blearily at my eyes, straining my ears. At first all I could hear was the usual chorus of crickets and peeper frogs. But then another sound reached me, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to reverberate through the ground itself. Slow, lumbering footsteps, and they were getting closer. I leapt to my feet, hatchet at the ready, my heart in my throat. "The bear?" I croaked. Jason shook his head, eyes wide. "I don't think so. This sounds bigger." We stared out into the suffocating darkness, Mark struggling to sit up on his bedroll. The footsteps grew louder, twigs snapping like gunshots in the stillness. An ungodly stench hit me then, like rotting flesh in decay. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose. Mark retched behind me. The thudding stopped. Oppressive silence fell. I hardly dared to breathe. And then I saw it. 2 points of eerie green light glowed in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Eyes, I realized with sinking horror. They blinked, then disappeared, as if the thing had turned its head. Heavy footfalls retreated back into the forest. For a moment, none of us moved, too shocked and terrified to process what we'd just witnessed. "Please tell me that was a bear," Mark said in a thin, reedy voice. "There's no way," I replied grimly. "Did you smell that stench? And those eyes?" "We need to leave," Jason cut in urgently. "Right now. Screw waiting for daylight. I'm not spending another minute in these god-forsaken woods." He didn't have to tell me twice. We broke camp in record time, throwing gear haphazardly into our packs and hauling a groaning Mark to his feet. The darkness felt viscous, cloying, as if it was deliberately trying to bog us down. The hike back to the road where we'd parked was a waking nightmare. Every snapped twig or owl hoot made us flinch and whirl around wildly. The stink of decay lingered at the edges of my awareness. I almost wept when the blessed sight of my pickup came into view. We piled in, and I floored it, gravel spraying as I sped off down the dirt track. I white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole way to the tiny local clinic, convinced that every shadow flitting across the road was that creature coming for us. It wasn't until the exhausted-looking night nurse assured us Mark's injuries were painful but not life-threatening that I finally started to breathe again. Safely ensconced in a shabby motel room with the first rays of dawn lightening the sky, the whole thing felt like a bad dream, the product of overactive imaginations, spooky stories, and the disorienting blackness of the deep forest at night. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But I couldn't shake the image of those malevolent green eyes boring into my soul. And some small, primitive part of my brain knew with gut-wrenching certainty that the Wendigo was real. That death had stalked us in those woods, and only dumb luck had allowed us to escape. I haven't set foot in the wilderness since that night, and I doubt I ever will again. The forest no longer feels like a sanctuary to me, but something older, darker, and more twisted than I ever could have imagined. There are things out there in the shadows that we aren't meant to see. Horrors that have existed long before man first crawled out of the primordial ooze. And sometimes, when the veil between our worlds wears thin, they reach out with grasping claws to drag us into the abyss. 2 months later, I sat hunched at my drafting table, staring blearily at the magazine layout on my computer screen. My shoulders were cramped, my eyes dry and gritty. A sudden ping from my phone made me jump. For a heart-stopping second, I was back in those woods, tensed for the sound of snapping branches under monstrous feet. Then my surroundings registered, the hum of the elderly AC unit, the squeak of my chair, afternoon light slanting across my desk. I let out a shaky breath and swiped open the text from Jason. My brow furrowed as I read it once, then again. Have you seen the news about those missing hikers in Oregon? The ones who were camping in the Mount Hood National Forest? They found their gear all torn up and scattered, but no sign of the bodies. Creepy stuff, man. Reminded me of our own close call. Think it could be related? A chill crept down my spine as I stared at the words on the small screen. Jason wasn't one for conspiracy theories or paranormal nonsense, so for him to even suggest such a thing meant he must have been seriously rattled. With trembling fingers, I pulled up a news article about the missing hikers. The details were unsettlingly sparse. A group of 3 friends, experienced outdoorsmen, had set off for a week-long trek in the Mount Hood wilderness. When they failed to return, a search party was dispatched, only to find a scene of chilling chaos at their last known campsite. The tent had been shredded to ribbons, sleeping bags torn open and strewn about as if a bomb had gone off. Food canisters were found 100 yards away, lids ripped off, contents spilling across the forest floor. Of the hikers themselves, not a single trace remained, not even tracks. Like they had simply been plucked out of existence. Authorities suspected a bear attack or perhaps a cougar. But no animal could have caused such destruction without leaving some sign behind. And that still didn't explain how 3 grown men, skilled in the outdoors, could have vanished into thin air without so much as a scrap of clothing or a drop of blood left behind. I thought again of those eerie green eyes in the woods, boring into my soul with ancient, insatiable hunger. The ungodly reek of death and decay. A shudder worked through me, and I had to set the phone down, my hands shaking too badly to type. Deep down, in a primordial part of my brain that knew to fear the dark, I was certain that whatever stalked Jason, Mark, and I that night had claimed new victims in Oregon, that the Wendigos' hunting grounds stretched far beyond the forests of the northern Midwest. How long had this thing, this abomination, walked the earth, preying on the unwary? Were there others like it, sleeping in their foul dens across the country, waiting for hapless campers to stumble into their territory? The questions spun in my mind, chasing each other like snarling beasts until a headache bloomed behind my eyes. I didn't want to know the answers. Suddenly, all I wanted was to be as far from trees and dirt and the inky blackness between the stars as I could get. I shut off my phone, not bothering to text Jason back, and returned to my design work with single-minded focus, desperate for the distraction. But a yawning pit had opened in my gut, an existential dread that writhed and whispered in my ear. "You aren't safe," it hissed. "You can't unsee what you saw, you can't unknow the truth. And one day, one night, when you let your guard down, it will come for you too. The dream is always the same." I'm back in the forest, running through the suffocating darkness, breath burning in my lungs and terror scorching my veins. Trees loom on all sides, grasping at me with skeletal branches. The Wendigo is out there in the shadows coming for me. I can hear its footsteps booming like war drums, feel its fetid breath on the back of my neck. No matter how fast I run, how desperately I push my battered body, it's never enough. Icy talons close around my ankle, wrenching me off my feet, dragging me back into its dripping jaws ringed with needle teeth. I open my mouth to scream, and I bolt upright in bed, chest heaving, sweat cooling on my skin. For a disoriented moment, I thrash against tangled sheets, convinced they're the Wendigo's clammy grip. Then reality seeps back in. My bedroom, bathed in the sickly orange glow of the streetlight outside, the distant wail of a siren, the stale smell of cigarette smoke from the neighbors downstairs. I sag back against the mattress, boneless with relief, and glance at the clock. 3:33 a.m., it blinks at me, mockingly. Always that same devilish hour. It's been 6 months since our ill-fated camping trip, and the nightmares haven't stopped. If anything, they're getting more frequent, more visceral. Some nights I swear I can taste the rot of the creature's breath on the back of my tongue when I wake. Resigned to another stretch of sleepless hours until dawn, I pad out to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee with shaking hands. My reflection in the microwave door gives me pause. Bloodshot eyes sunk in bruised sockets, sallow skin, unkempt stubble. The fluorescent light hums and flickers as I slump at the dinette with my mug, thousands of worries chasing each other in my mind. How long can I keep going on like this, hollow-eyed and twitchy, tormented by memories of that thing in the dark? Will this be my life now, forever stuck in the liminal space between waking and nightmare? Those hikers in Oregon were never found. They joined the ranks of the vanished dozens, the mysteriously disappeared. More have gone missing in the intervening months all over the country. Appalachia, the Ozarks, the remote wildernesses of Northern California and Washington. I've become obsessed, spending hours falling down internet rabbit holes, reading every scrap of lore and legend I can find on the Wendigo, on creatures that match its description. I know on some level that I'm courting madness with this fixation, that I'm not going to like what I find at the bottom of this awful barrel of secrets, but I can't stop. That's the insidious thing about brushing up against true dread, about learning the kinds of truths we beg to forget. Once you open Pandora's box, you can't cram the whispering chaos back inside. So here I sit, night after night, surrounded by the blue glow of my laptop and the bitter smoke of my cigarette, chasing mysteries for which I don't truly want answers. Mysteries that might consume me long before any monster's jaws ever could. Staring into the black mirror of the kitchen window and wondering, always wondering, if those green eyes are staring back. It's been a year. A year since that disastrous night in the North Woods changed everything, since I looked into the abyss and felt it looking back. I had to get out of Pittsburgh, away from the clutter and the noise and the light pollution that paradoxically only made the shadows feel deeper, more treacherous, as if all that buzz and glow was just a camouflage, a flimsy curtain drawn over yawning maw of the dark. So I headed west, to the mountains of Colorado. Not ideal, perhaps, for someone trying to escape their fear of the wild places. But I needed room to breathe, and there's nothing like the thin air and sprawling vistas of the Rockies for that. I found work at a local print shop, a far cry from my cutthroat advertising career, but uncomplicated in a way I desperately craved. And slowly, I started putting my fractured self back together. There are still nights when I wake up soaked in icy sweat, biting back screams. Still times when a flash of green from a traffic light or a stray whiff of something foul sends me right back to that foul clearing. I don't know if those scars will ever fade entirely, but I'm learning to muffle my panicked brain, to reason through my fears. I remind myself that whatever stalks the forests can't reach me here, nestled amid the bustle and light of civilization. That if I just keep moving, keep looking forward, I can outrun the nightmares snapping at my heels. I talk to Mark and Jason often, more than we ever did before that night bound us together in terrible knowledge. They're doing better too. Or at least they're getting good at pretending. We don't talk about what happened, about the missing people that made the news for a month or two before fading back into obscurity. But it's there between the lines, an invisible thread tying us to each other. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed it all. If my tired, stressed-out mind just conjured a monster from campfire tales and shadows. But then I remember those eyes, that stench. The bone-deep, visceral certainty that I was in the presence of something ancient and cold and utterly inhuman. You don't imagine a feeling like that. You sure as hell don't forget it. So I keep my head down, and my feet moving, and I cling to the daylight like a charm against evil. And on the nights when that acrid phantom smell comes creeping back into my nose, I remind myself of all the miles and mountains between me and those fathomless woods. It's a thin comfort, but it's all I have. Because deep in the back of my mind, I know the truth. I may have escaped the Wendigo's claws, but I'll never be free of the scars it left on my soul. I've seen the face of true darkness, and it's out there still, waiting patiently in the spaces between the trees, watching, hungering, biding its time until the stars align and the barriers thin and some other poor doomed souls wander into its mossy domain, unaware that they're already damned.